To design an effective asana sequence, I follow a simple 3-step formula. Analyzing the anatomy of the peak pose. In this step, we will understand what are the key muscle and the joint movement happening in the peak pose. Step number 3. Without understanding the structure and science behind sequencing, your yoga class will be ineffective. So our sequence would look like this. Starting with Adhomukh Virasana, then Supta Padangushtasana A, then Adhomukh Shwan Asana with chair, Prasarit Padottan Asana. If you decide to run a marathon, how would you prepare? Would you start running 21 kilometers every day? Or you would start with shorter distances of 5 kilometers or less, build endurance, and then eventually run 21 kilometers. Starting with 21 kilometers every day would be a mistake, right? That's the same mistake most yoga teachers make when they create asana sequences. They try to make long 60-minute sequence in which they would include all type of asanas and they would change asanas every day to make it interesting without actually understanding the structure and the science behind sequencing. Without understanding the structure and science behind sequencing, your yoga class will be ineffective. So why not make small sequences, understand the structure and the science behind sequencing, and then eventually make a effective 60-minute sequence. Hello yoga teachers and practitioners. My name is Neeraj Deshwal. I'm a yoga teacher trainer from Body Mind Alliance. In the previous lesson, we learned 3 principles based on which we make our asana sequences. In this lesson, we are going to deep dive into asana sequencing process. So let's begin. To design an effective asana sequence, I follow a simple 3-step formula. Starting with step 1, choosing the peak pose. Peak pose is the most challenging pose in the sequence or a part of the sequence. Now people have different definition of peak pose. We will understand it better when we learn with the help of an example. Now coming to step 2, analyzing the anatomy of the peak pose. In this step, we will understand what are the key muscle and the joint movement happening in the peak pose. Step number 3, choosing the prep poses. Now these poses will help you to prepare for peak pose. These poses will have similar function as peak pose, which means it will have similar joint movement or muscle engagement. Now let's design a sequence using this formula. We will begin with a small sequence of 3 asanas only. So I'll begin with step 1, which is choosing the peak pose, and I'll choose Uttanasana. Now step 2, analyzing the anatomy of peak pose. Now in Uttanasana, you need good length in your hamstring muscle and your spinal extensor muscle. Now we need to think of asanas where spinal extensor muscle is stretching and your hamstring is stretching. And the first posture that comes to my mind is Adhomukh Virasana. In this asana, your spinal extensor muscle stretches. So this is my first prep pose. Now we will do our second prep pose, which is Supta Padangushta Asana A. Why I chose this posture? Because it gives a good stretch to your hamstring muscle, which will prepare you for Uttanasana. And third pose is obviously our peak pose, which is Uttanasana. So we created a small sequence where we moved in a single direction. Now we can expand this sequence by adding more asanas or more prep poses. So we have to think of the postures where spinal extensor muscles are stretching and where your hamstring is stretching. One such posture is Adhomukh Shwan Asana, but we will use a chair for this sequence. So after Supta Padangushtasana, you can add Adhomukh Shwan Asana with chair. Then you can also add Prasarit Padottan Asana. If you would have noticed, when you separate your feet in Prasarit Padottan Asana, forward folding is easier than in Uttanasana. So it will give your spinal extensor muscle a good stretch before you go in Uttanasana. So our new expanded sequence would look like this. Adhomukh Veer Asana, Supt Padangushtasana variation A, Adhomukh Shwanasana, Prasarit Paduttanasana and Uttana Asana. We can design so many sequences using this formula. So let's design one more. Let's choose our peak pose, which is Paschim Uttan Asana. In Paschim Uttanasana, again, your hamstring muscle and your spinal extensor muscle needs to stretch. So our prep poses could be Adhomukh Veerasana and Supta Padangushtasana A. But we will do some variation with Adhomukh Veerasana. We will also do Parshva Adhomukh Veer Asana so that we are stretching the quadratus lumborum muscle on both the side, which will help in Paschimottanasana. Now let's do something interesting. We will club these two sequences and make a larger sequence. So our sequence would look like this. Starting with Adhomukh Veerasana, then Supta Padangushtasana A, then Adhomukh Shwan Asana with chair, Prasarit Paduttan Asana, Uttan Asana, then again Adhomukh Shwan Asana with chair, Adhomukh Veer Asana, Parshva Adhomukh Veer Asana, then Paschim Uttan Asana. If you observe the entire sequence, it is working on your calves, your hamstring and your spinal extensor muscle. We have a clear understanding of how it is impacting the body, and the asanas are well placed in the sequence. So that is why this sequence is really impactful and effective. We can create more such sequences using this 3-step formula. Now you might wonder, where are the warm-up poses, where are the counter poses and resting poses? Don't worry, we are going to integrate them in the sequence in the upcoming lessons. Right now, we are focusing on the core structure of the sequence. It's like writing a perfect script for the movie. In the beginning, we introduce the characters, then we move on to the main plot, then climax, then a happy ending. So that is how we are making this sequence. We will start with warm-up sequences, then we have the core structure of the sequence, counter poses and then resting poses. Now we are going to design sequences from scratch which will form the core structure of the sequence. So that's all from this lesson. I'll see you in the next one.